A 14-year-old boy stared into his phone camera with a smile that would haunt the internet forever. The camera showed his bedroom, sunlit and ordinary. Behind him, a quiet house. He had thousands of viewers watching. Hearts floated across the screen. Comments poured in from people who had no idea what they were about to witness. He adjusted the camera angle slightly. He checked the viewer count, 8,000, and climbing. He said something to the camera. His voice was steady. He was calm. Then he told his audience to watch this. The words were casual, the kind of thing a teenager says when they're about to show off something they think is impressive. Moments later, a sound echoed through the house that changed everything. The live stream kept rolling. The viewers kept watching. And what unfolded in the next few minutes would become evidence in a case that would shake a nation's understanding of youth, technology, and accountability. Stories like this remind us that justice doesn't pause for an audience. It works, it investigates, and it holds people accountable, regardless of age or digital reach. If you believe that responsibility matters in every medium, subscribe now and share what you think in the comments below. Let's look at how the internet itself became a witness to the unthinkable. Before the stream, there was a home. Not a palace or a place of wealth, but a modest suburban house with a driveway and a mailbox, and a father who worked shifts to pay the mortgage. The father was a quiet man, the kind who didn't understand social media, who thought his son's obsession with uploading videos and gathering followers was strange and vaguely concerning. He had tried to set boundaries. He had asked his son to spend less time on his phone and more time doing homework, playing outside, being present with his family. These were the conversations that happened in many homes across the country. Conflicts between parents trying to protect their children from screen addiction and teenagers fighting for the freedom to control their own lives. But in this house, the conflict was escalating into something darker. The boy had begun to resent his father's rules. He had begun to see his father as an obstacle to his dreams of online fame. He had begun to fantasize about what his life would be like without the limitations his father imposed. And somewhere in those fantasies, a terrible plan had begun to take shape. The phone was propped against a textbook on the desk, angled perfectly to capture the boy's face and the room behind him. He had positioned it this way dozens of times before. The lighting was good, natural light from the window combined with the soft glow of the desk lamp. He knew how to set up for optimal video quality. He had spent hours studying other live streamers, analyzing their techniques, learning what made people stop scrolling and start watching. He had 2,000 followers. He wanted 10,000. He wanted 100,000. He wanted to be the kind of person that other people talked about, that other people knew about, that other people envied. This live stream was going to change everything. He had decided that this morning when he woke up. This was going to be the moment when everything shifted. He had been planning it for weeks, though he had told no one. He had researched it. He had thought about how it would unfold. He had imagined the comments that would appear, the shock value, the way people would react. The chat was already active. People were greeting him. Regular viewers who watched his streams said hello. New viewers were joining, curious about what this particular stream might contain. He had posted a teaser earlier that day, a cryptic message saying that something big was about to happen. Something that would get people's attention. Something that would make him famous. The mystery had drawn people in. By the time he actually went live, he already had several thousand viewers waiting. He looked at the comment section and smiled. This was what he wanted. This feeling of people paying attention to him, of mattering to an audience, of having power in a digital space where his physical reality felt powerless. His father had told him earlier that day to put the phone away. His father had said that he was spending too much time online. His father had threatened to take his phone. His father was the problem. His father was the obstacle. His father was standing between him and the future he wanted. The live stream had been running for about 4 minutes when his father came into the room. The boy didn't break character. He kept talking to the camera, kept engaging with the comments, kept smiling. His father asked him what he was doing. The boy told him he was streaming to his followers. His father said it was time to stop, time to do something else, Time to put the phone away. The boy told his father to wait, that he would be done soon. His father said no, it was time now. The tone of his voice suggested that this was not a request. This was a parent exercising authority over a child who had stopped listening. The boy felt the anger rise in him. Anger at being interrupted. Anger at being told what to do. Anger at the unfairness of a world where his father got to make decisions about his life, where his father got to limit him, where his father got to stand in the way of what he wanted. He told his father that he was busy. He told his father to leave. He told his father that he didn't care what his father wanted. The argument escalated quickly, voices raised, words spoken that couldn't be unspoken. The camera was still recording. The viewers were still watching. The boy's focus was divided between his father and the chat, between the physical confrontation happening in his room and the digital audience watching it unfold. Comments were appearing faster now. Viewers were asking what was happening. Viewers were expressing concern. Viewers were making jokes. Viewers were telling him to turn the camera so they could see better. The boy felt a strange surge of power. He had an audience. He had people watching. He had people who cared about what was happening to him. His father reached for the phone. The boy pulled it away. The phone nearly fell. The boy caught it. He held it steady, kept it pointed at himself, kept the camera rolling. His father was angry now, truly angry in a way that the boy had not seen before. His father said something about consequences. His father said something about respect. His father said something about the phone being taken away permanently. And in that moment, in the space where the boy felt his power being threatened, in the moment where he understood that his father was actually going to take the phone, that his father was actually going to end the live stream, that his father was actually going to remove the one thing that made him feel important, something inside him broke. Or perhaps nothing broke. Perhaps something that had never been properly formed simply revealed itself. He moved toward his father with an object from his desk. The movement was fast. The impact was sudden. The sound carried through the microphone clearly enough that even the most casual viewer understood that something terrible had just happened. The father fell. The boy stood there, still holding the phone, still facing the camera, still streaming to thousands of people. He looked at his father. He looked at the chat. He looked at the viewer count, which was climbing rapidly as more and more people clicked into the stream, drawn by the frantic comments of people who had already understood what they had just witnessed. The boy did not immediately turn off the stream. This was the detail that would haunt investigators, that would haunt prosecutors, that would haunt the jury. He did not rush to help his father. He did not panic. He did not turn away from the camera in shock or horror. Instead, he checked the viewer count. He checked the comments. He looked at the metrics, the engagement, the reach that his stream was achieving. Then, after what felt like an eternity but was actually only seconds, he ended the broadcast. The screen went black. The stream was over. But thousands of people had already recorded it. Thousands of people had already saved clips. Thousands of people had already shared it. The digital footprint was permanent. The evidence was preserved. The crime had been documented in real time by the defendant himself, broadcast to strangers, immortalized on servers and devices and in the cloud. The camera had captured everything. And the camera would not lie. The father's name was Michael. He was 48 years old. He worked in construction management. He had worked in that field for 22 years. He was the kind of man who took pride in his work, who showed up early and left late, who made sure that projects were completed on schedule and within budget. He was the kind of man who was respected by his colleagues, but not particularly close to anyone. He kept his personal life separate from his professional life. He didn't talk much about his son. He didn't talk much about anything. He was private in a way that was becoming increasingly rare, a man who preferred face-to-face conversations to digital ones. A man who believed that certain conversations should happen in person, with eye contact, with the possibility of genuine human connection. His marriage had ended 3 years earlier. The divorce had been amicable by most standards. He and his ex-wife had agreed on custody arrangements. They had agreed on financial support. They had agreed that they both still loved their son, even though they no longer loved each other. The separation had been difficult for the boy. Michael had tried to maintain normalcy, to keep the household functioning, to be present and available despite the stress of the separation and the demands of his job. He had picked his son up from school on days when it was his custody. He had helped with homework. He had made sure there was food in the refrigerator. He had tried to be the kind of father that showed up, that paid attention, that cared. But somewhere along the way, his son had begun to resent him. The boy had become increasingly focused on his phone, increasingly invested in his online presence, increasingly dismissive of the real-world relationships in his life. Michael had noticed the change. He had worried about it. He had tried to address it by setting boundaries. He had limited screen time. He had asked his son to put the phone away during meals. He had suggested activities they could do together that didn't involve looking at screens. He had tried to bridge the gap that was widening between them, but his son had resisted every attempt. The boy had seen the limitations not as expressions of care, but as expressions of control. The boy had interpreted the boundaries as personal attacks, as attempts to undermine him, as obstacles to his success in the digital world that he believed was far more real and far more important than the physical world they inhabited together. Michael had found himself increasingly frustrated. He had found himself wondering what had happened to his son, wondering when the cheerful, curious child he had known had transformed into this moody, phone-obsessed teenager who seemed to barely tolerate his presence. The morning of his death, Michael had woken up at 5:30, as he did every morning. He had showered. He had dressed in his work clothes. He had made coffee. He had eaten breakfast alone because his son was still asleep. He had left a note on the counter reminding his son about a homework assignment that was due. He had left cash for lunch. He had left a voicemail on his ex-wife's phone, letting her know that he would be working an extra shift that evening, that he wouldn't be picking their son up from school, that she should arrange for someone to check on him, or that the boy could go to a friend's house. The voicemail was casual, routine, the kind of message that Michael left frequently. He had no idea that it would be the last communication he ever had with his ex-wife. He had no idea that by the time his ex-wife heard that voicemail, he would be dead. At school that day, Michael's son had told his friends that he had plans. He had told them that something big was going to happen. He had been cryptic and vague, the way teenagers sometimes are when they want to seem important without actually revealing anything. His friends had assumed he meant something normal, a party, a gathering, an event of some kind. They had no idea what he was actually planning. They had no idea that he was planning to commit an act that would change all of their lives, that would traumatize them, that would force them to confront the reality that someone they knew, someone they went to school with, someone they had considered a friend, was capable of something that seemed impossible. Michael left work at 5 o'clock. He drove home. The traffic was moderate. He listened to a podcast. He thought about what he would have for dinner. He thought about whether his son might want to watch a movie together, whether there might be a way to reconnect, whether the tension between them might eventually ease. He pulled into the driveway. He gathered his things from the car. He unlocked the front door. He stepped inside the house that he owned, the house where he had tried to raise a good son, the house where he had hoped to create a stable and loving home. He had no idea that stepping inside that door was stepping toward the moment that would end his life. He had no idea that his son was upstairs in his room preparing to broadcast his death to thousands of strangers. He had no idea that his final conversation would be an argument about a phone. He had no idea that the thing he had feared most about his son's obsession with the digital world, that it would consume him, that it would make him lose sight of what was real and what mattered, was about to become a prophecy that would come terribly true. The first call to emergency services came at 5:43 in the afternoon. The caller was hysterical. The caller was describing something that didn't immediately make sense to the dispatcher. The caller was saying that they had been watching a live stream. The caller was saying that they had witnessed something happening. The caller was saying that someone needed to go to an address immediately. The dispatcher had to ask multiple times for clarification. Was there a crime in progress? Was someone in danger? Was the caller calling about something that was happening right now, or something that they had seen online? The confusion lasted for several minutes, but eventually, the dispatcher understood that multiple people were calling in about a live stream that had shown violence. The address was extracted from the call. Police were dispatched. By the time the first police officer arrived at the house, there were already dozens of people who had seen the live stream. They had recorded it. They had posted clips to social media. They had shared it with friends. They had begun the process of making it viral. The digital spread was happening in real time, simultaneously with the physical investigation that was about to begin. The officer approached the house. The front door was locked. The officer tried to see through the windows. There was no immediate sign of activity. The officer called for backup. Other officers arrived. They made entry into the house. What they found inside was a scene that matched what thousands of online viewers had already witnessed, but that took on a new weight when confronted with it in person. Michael was on the floor of the upstairs hallway. The boy was in his room. He was sitting calmly on his bed. He was not crying. He was not panicking. He was not acting as though he had just killed his father. He was sitting with his hands folded in his lap, looking at the officers with an expression that suggested confusion about what all the fuss was about. The officers moved quickly. The scene was secured. The boy was taken into custody. The house became a crime scene. Photographs were taken. Evidence was collected. The phone was seized. The live stream had been ended, but the platform had automatically saved a copy. Multiple copies existed. The digital evidence was preserved by the sheer nature of how the Internet works. Information, once shared, cannot be truly deleted. The medical examiner arrived. The body was examined. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma. The weapon was found in the boy's room. It was an object that had been on his desk, something he had used for schoolwork. The object had been converted into a weapon through action and intent. The timeline was clear. The boy had ended the stream at exactly 5:39. The live stream itself was recovered and preserved as evidence. It showed the argument. It showed the escalation. It showed the moment when the boy acted. It showed the father falling. It showed the boy checking his metrics rather than helping his father. Everything was there. Everything was documented. Everything was preserved. The boy was brought to the police station. He was placed in an interrogation room. Detectives who had years of experience interviewing suspects were struck by something unusual about this boy. He did not seem to understand the gravity of what he had done. He seemed confused by the questions. He seemed more concerned about what had happened to his phone than about what had happened to his father. When asked directly about the live stream, he asked if it had gone viral. He asked how many views it had gotten. He asked if anyone important had seen it. The detectives looked at each other in disbelief. A 14-year-old boy had just killed his father, and his primary concern was the digital reach of the broadcast. The disconnect was profound and deeply disturbing. The boy's mother was called. She was informed that her son was in police custody, that her ex-husband was dead, that she needed to come to the police station immediately. She arrived in a state of shock. She asked repeatedly if there was a mistake, if they were certain, if there was any possibility that they were wrong. They were not wrong. The live stream existed. The evidence was clear. Her son had killed his father. She broke down. She asked how this was possible. She asked what had happened to her son. She asked if he had been in some kind of mental crisis that she hadn't noticed. No one had answers that would help her. No one had answers that would make sense of a situation that defied sense. In the interrogation room, the boy's first statement was unexpected. He didn't deny that he had killed his father. He didn't claim innocence. He didn't express remorse. Instead, he told a story about a prank that had gone wrong. He said that he had wanted to frighten his father. He said that he had wanted to get a reaction for the live stream. He said that he hadn't meant to actually hurt his father. He said that things had escalated quickly, that his father had moved in a way he wasn't expecting, that the impact had been harder than he intended. The narrative was constructed carefully, using language that suggested a teenager trying to minimize the severity of his actions, trying to position himself as having made a mistake rather than having committed a premeditated act. The detectives listened to the statement with growing skepticism. They asked him about the preparation. Had he planned the live stream? Yes. Had he told anyone that something big was about to happen? Yes. Had he positioned the phone to capture the action? Yes. Had he checked the viewer count while his father was on the floor? When asked directly, the boy's composure wavered slightly. He said that he had just wanted to see if people were watching. He said that it was instinctive. He said that he hadn't been thinking clearly. The detectives noted that his language showed premeditation at every level. The setup, the timing, the positioning, the broadcasting. All of it had been deliberate. The prank narrative was a performance, an attempt to reframe calculated violence as an accident. One of the detectives asked a question that would become significant to the case. He asked the boy why he hadn't ended the live stream immediately after his father fell. Why had he continued broadcasting? Why had he checked the viewer count? Why had he seemed more interested in the metrics than in his father's condition? The boy couldn't answer these questions satisfactorily. He said he didn't know. He said he wasn't thinking about it. He said it was just what he did automatically. But the automatic response revealed something about the boy's priorities. He was so accustomed to monitoring engagement, to checking metrics, to measuring his worth through digital feedback, that even in the moment after committing an act of violence, his primary instinct was to check how many people were watching. His father's condition was secondary to the digital response. The boy's phone was examined. The investigators pulled the metadata from the live stream. They looked at the timestamps. They examined the deleted files to see if there had been practice streams, if the boy had rehearsed what he was going to do. They found test recordings. They found recordings where the boy was practicing the sequence of events. The evidence of premeditation was overwhelming. This was not a spontaneous act. This was not a moment of passion that had escalated. This was a planned action that the boy had practiced, refined, and then executed while broadcasting it to an audience. The prank gone wrong narrative collapsed under the weight of the digital evidence. The boy was charged with murder. Despite his age, the severity of the crime, the premeditation, and the calculated nature of the broadcast meant that prosecutors considered trying him as an adult. The boy's attorney immediately began advocating for consideration of his age, for recognition of adolescent development, for the possibility that the boy's obsession with online engagement had somehow altered his ability to make moral decisions. The debate began about whether a 14-year-old could be held fully responsible for his actions, whether his digital obsession was an explanation or an excuse, whether the justice system should focus on punishment or rehabilitation. The Livestream platform was subpoenaed for all data related to the broadcast. The platform complied. They provided metadata, timestamps, chat records, viewer information, and the unedited stream itself. The data revealed a level of detail that was both invaluable to the investigation and deeply disturbing. The live stream had been viewed by approximately 43,000 people in real time. Comments had poured in at a rate of several hundred per second after the violence occurred. Some viewers had recorded the stream, some had clipped it, some had shared it to social media. By the time the platform had taken the stream down, it had already spread across the internet. Multiple copies existed in various forms. The digital forensics team examined the metadata in detail. They looked at the timestamp of when the live stream had been initiated. They looked at the recordings on the boy's phone to see how long he had been planning the event. They found that he had created a private draft stream the day before. He had recorded segments of it. He had used those recordings to practice what he was going to say, how he was going to position the camera, how he was going to interact with the audience. He had refined the performance until it was exactly what he wanted. The evidence of premeditation extended back at least 24 hours, possibly longer. The chat records were examined. During the live stream, before the violence occurred, the boy had received comments from people asking him to do something crazy. He had received messages from followers saying that his streams were boring, that he needed to make more exciting content, that he needed to do something that would get him attention. The boy had responded to some of these comments. He had indicated that he was about to deliver exactly what they wanted. Some viewers had apparently thought that he was joking. Some had apparently understood that something serious was about to happen. After the violence, some comments expressed horror. Some expressed excitement. Some expressed the kind of digital detachment that allowed people to treat real-world violence as content to be consumed and shared. The phone itself contained a goldmine of evidence. The boy's search history showed queries about how to go viral, about what makes content shareable, about the psychology of engagement, about how influencers maintain their audience. He had researched his father's work schedule. He had researched what his father would be doing at specific times. He had researched when his father would be home alone. He had researched the best time to broadcast to reach his target demographic. Every aspect of the crime had been researched. Every detail had been planned. The boy had treated the murder of his father as a content strategy, as a way to achieve the digital fame he desperately wanted. The forensic examiner who presented these findings to the investigators noted something that was particularly troubling. The boy had not shown any indication that he was planning suicide after committing the murder. He had not written any farewell messages. He had not expressed any understanding that his life was about to change fundamentally. He had seemed to genuinely believe that he would be able to continue streaming after this event, that he would be able to use the attention from the live stream to build his platform, that he might even become famous for what he had done. The disconnect from reality was profound. The boy seemed incapable of understanding that murder was a crime with permanent, life-altering consequences. The psychological evaluation of the boy was comprehensive and troubling. The psychologist who examined him noted that the boy displayed characteristics consistent with narcissistic personality patterns: an excessive need for validation through digital engagement, an inability to delay gratification, an inability to understand how his actions affected other people, a sense of entitlement, a belief that the rules that governed other people's behavior didn't apply to him. These were traits that could be found in many teenagers, but in this boy, they were present at an intensity that was concerning. The school records revealed additional details. The boy had been disciplined multiple times for attention-seeking behavior. He had created fake accounts to post about himself. He had spread rumors about himself to generate attention. He had lied about achievements to impress other students. He had become increasingly aggressive towards students who didn't acknowledge his online presence. Teachers reported that he was obsessed with the number of followers he had, that he constantly checked his phone for notifications, that he seemed unable to focus on anything that didn't relate to his online persona. The behavior suggested that the boy's sense of self-worth had become entirely dependent on digital validation. The boy's relationship with his father had deteriorated significantly over the past year. Teachers and school counselors reported that the boy had made comments in class suggesting anger toward his father, resentment about the boundaries his father had set, frustration about screen time limitations. The boy had talked about how his father didn't understand him, how his father was trying to sabotage his dreams, how his father was the primary obstacle to his success. The narrative had been building in the boy's mind for months, a story where his father was the villain and he was the misunderstood hero struggling against depression. When asked by the psychologist whether he felt remorse for killing his father, The boy's response was chilling. He said that he did feel bad about it, but when asked to elaborate, he didn't talk about his father's death. He talked about the impact on himself. He talked about how the incident would affect his future, how it would change the public perception of him, how it might limit his opportunities. The remorse was entirely self-focused. It was not about the loss of life. It was not about the impact on his family. It was about the impact on his own life and his own plans. During one session, the boy asked the psychologist a question that revealed the depth of his disconnect from reality. He asked if the incident might lead to documentary deals, if his story might become the subject of a true crime series, if he might somehow become famous through the incident. The psychologist was so taken aback by the question that she had to pause before responding. The boy seemed to genuinely believe that even the murder of his father, could be a pathway to the digital fame he wanted. The psychologist noted in her report that the boy appeared to have a fundamental inability to understand the gravity of his actions, that he seemed incapable of empathizing with his father's death, and that his primary concern was how the situation affected his own interests. The boy's mother struggled with the reality of what her son had done. She had loved him. She had raised him. She had tried to give him everything that she could, and he had killed his father. The grief was complicated by the knowledge of what her son was capable of. She had to mourn the loss of her ex-husband while simultaneously confronting the reality of what her son had become. She had to attend his funeral while knowing that her own child was responsible for his death. She had to listen to people offer condolences while understanding that the person who had caused the death was her responsibility. Extended family members struggled with how to respond. Some wanted to support the mother. Some wanted to distance themselves from her, fearing that the association with her family might somehow taint them. Some wanted to support the boy, believing that he had made a terrible mistake and deserved the chance to rehabilitate. Others wanted nothing to do with him, wanted to sever all family ties, wanted to pretend that he didn't exist. The family fractured. Phone calls became arguments. Family gatherings became tense and uncomfortable. The death of one family member had led to the emotional death of relationships within the family. The boy's interaction with his mother in the holding facility was telling. He did not express grief. He did not apologize. He asked her questions about his case, about how the media was covering the incident, about whether his followers were still interested in his content, about whether he might be able to post updates from jail. His mother found herself unable to look at him, unable to speak to him, unable to reconcile the child she had known with the person she was now facing. The visits became increasingly difficult. Eventually, the mother stopped coming. The emotional weight of the situation was simply too much. The father's family requested that media coverage focus on the victim rather than the perpetrator. They didn't want their brother, their son, their uncle to be remembered primarily as the man killed by his teenage son. They wanted his life to be honored, his memory to be respected, his humanity to be acknowledged. They gave interviews about the kind of man he had been. They talked about his dedication to his work, his love for his son despite the conflict, his quiet integrity. They talked about the life that had been taken, the future that had been erased. They talked about the grandson who had killed him, the family member who had destroyed them. The impact on the younger siblings of the accused boy was profound. They had to go to school knowing that their brother was in custody, that their father was dead, that the entire family had been shattered. They had to deal with the reactions of their peers, some sympathetic, some mocking, some simply curious in the way that teenagers can be about trauma that doesn't affect them. The normal rhythms of adolescent life had been disrupted. Everything that had seemed stable had been revealed to be fragile. Everything that they had taken for granted had been exposed as temporary. The juvenile court was packed. The case had attracted significant media attention. The combination of a minor defendant, a live-streamed crime, and the premeditation that the evidence revealed had captured public imagination. News cameras waited outside the courthouse. Reporters prepared statements for the afternoon news cycle. Spectators who had no direct connection to the case waited in line to get a seat in the gallery, wanting to witness the proceedings, wanting to see the boy who had killed his father and broadcast it to the world. The boy entered the courtroom in restraints. He was small for his age. He was dressed in appropriate clothing, not an orange jumpsuit, because the juvenile system tried to preserve some dignity even for the most serious offenders. But the restraints were visible. The chains around his wrists connected to a chain around his waist. The message was clear. This was a dangerous person who needed to be secured. When the boy saw the courtroom, when he saw the number of people watching, something flickered across his face. For a moment, it seemed like he was enjoying the attention. For a moment, it seemed like being the center of this spectacle was exactly what he had wanted all along. The judge was a woman named Patricia Hernandez. She had presided over juvenile cases for 19 years. She had seen troubled children. She had seen children who had committed serious crimes. She had worked within a system that theoretically believed in rehabilitation and second chances. But she had also seen the limits of rehabilitation, the cases where a child's capacity for harm was so fundamental that no amount of intervention would change it. Judge Hernandez looked at this boy and saw someone who was still performing, still seeking validation through the attention he was receiving, still trying to position himself as interesting or important, rather than as someone who had committed a terrible crime. The charges were read: murder. The boy did not appear shocked or frightened. He appeared bored, as though the proceedings were mildly interesting but not particularly important. The judge noted his demeanor and made a mental note. She addressed the courtroom and immediately set a tone. She said that this was not a platform for the defendant. She said that the proceedings would not be used to generate content or publicity. She said that anyone found recording or attempting to broadcast any portion of the trial would be removed and held in contempt of court. She was speaking directly to the reality of how the case had begun, with a crime broadcast to thousands of viewers for engagement and attention. She was making clear that her courtroom would not be used in the same way. The defense attorney made arguments about the boy's age, about the developing adolescent brain, about the possibility of rehabilitation. The prosecutor made arguments about the premeditation, the calculation, the careful planning that had preceded the crime. The prosecutor presented evidence that the boy had practiced the crime, that he had planned it, that he had executed it with intent. The prosecutor argued that the severity of the crime and the evidence of premeditation warranted trying the boy in adult court. The judge said that she would consider all of these factors. The trial began 3 weeks later. The first witness was a digital forensics expert who explained the live stream to the jury. She walked them through the metadata, the timestamps, the technical details of how live streams work. She explained that the platform maintained a record of all broadcasts. She explained that deletion by the user didn't actually delete the content from the servers. She explained that multiple viewers had already downloaded and saved copies before the platform took it down. She explained that the live stream was evidence, permanent and irrefutable. The jury was asked if they wanted to watch the stream. This was a significant moment. Watching it meant witnessing the crime in real time. It meant seeing the boy's expression, hearing his voice, understanding his demeanor. It meant experiencing what thousands of viewers had experienced when they tuned in. The jury agreed to watch it. The courtroom was silent as the stream played. The lighting was natural, peaceful. The boy's face was calm, smiling. His voice was steady. And then the argument with his father began. The escalation was visible. The moment when the boy acted was sudden. The sound of impact was clear. The boy's response, checking the viewer count, looking at the comments, was undeniable. By the time the stream ended, every juror had a clear understanding of what had happened. The platform moderator testified about the comments that had been posted during the live stream. She described the thousands of comments, the requests for more excitement, the reactions to the violence. She described the sheer volume of engagement that the stream had generated. She described how the stream had trended on the platform, how it had been shared across social media, how thousands of additional people had seen it after it was originally broadcast. The evidence that the boy had achieved the digital fame he wanted was undeniable. The crime had been profitable for him in terms of engagement and reach. The phone was introduced as evidence. The text messages between the boy and his friends were read aloud. He had told them that something big was about to happen. He had been cryptic and vague. After the incident, some of his friends had texted him asking what had happened, if he was okay, if they could help. The boy's responses had been evasive. He hadn't expressed concern about his father. He had expressed frustration about his phone being taken, about being brought to the police station, about the investigation interfering with his ability to continue streaming. The father's co-workers testified about what kind of man he had been. They described his dedication, his reliability, his quiet integrity. They described him as someone who was not particularly open about his personal life, but who was clearly dedicated to his son, who talked about parenting challenges, who expressed concern about his son's online behavior. The father was humanized for the jury. He was no longer just the victim. He was a real person with a real life, a real job, real relationships. His death was a loss, not just an event. The impact of the trial proceedings on the boy's online presence was significant. His followers began to abandon him. The people who had once encouraged him to do something crazy now expressed horror at what he had actually done. The comments on his archived streams changed. People began to recognize that this was not a game, that this was not content, that this was a real person's death. The digital community that had fostered his obsession with attention began to recoil from him. A former follower testified for the prosecution. This was a person who had watched the boy's streams regularly. This person said that the boy had explicitly told his audience that he was going to do something big, something that would change everything, something that would make him famous. This person said that the audience had encouraged him, had asked him to escalate, had pushed him to do more dramatic things. This person said that in retrospect, the warning signs had been there all along, but that at the time, it had all seemed like entertainment, like content, like a performance. This person said that they felt guilty for having encouraged him, for having been part of the audience that had rewarded his behavior with attention and engagement. Public sentiment began to shift. Initially, there had been people who were sympathetic to the boy, who wanted to believe that he was a victim of his circumstances, that his obsession with digital validation was an explanation for his actions. But as the evidence accumulated, as the premeditation became clear, as the lack of remorse became undeniable, public opinion moved toward accountability. News outlets began to discuss digital addiction, the psychology of engagement, the way that social media platforms reward sensational behavior. Discussions began about whether platforms had a responsibility to monitor concerning behavior, whether algorithms that prioritize engagement had contributed to the crime, whether society as a whole had failed in some way by creating an environment where a child could become so obsessed with online validation that he would kill his own father for the possibility of going viral. The judge began to make comments about the nature of the case. She noted that this was not just a crime. This was a crime that had been broadcast, that had been turned into content, that had been celebrated by some segments of the audience. She noted that the trial itself was being covered extensively by media, that every detail was being shared, that the case was becoming part of the cultural conversation. She warned that her courtroom would not be used to further sensationalize the crime. She warned that she would hold all parties accountable if they attempted to turn the proceedings into entertainment. The defense presented their case with the argument that the boy was young, that his brain was still developing, that he had made a terrible mistake. They called psychologists who testified about adolescent development, about the parts of the teenage brain that are still maturing, about the reduced capacity for impulse control in adolescence. They argued that the boy should not be tried as an adult, that the juvenile system was designed for exactly this kind of case, that rehabilitation was still possible even after a serious crime. The prosecution's expert witnesses were more persuasive. They testified that the boy's crime was not the result of impulsive adolescence. It was the result of careful planning. The boy had researched the crime. He had practiced it. He had positioned himself for success. The psychologist testified that the boy's lack of empathy, his inability to understand how his actions affected others, his complete focus on his own needs and desires, were personality traits that had developed over years, not just adolescent quirks that would be outgrown with time and maturity. The boy was called to testify. He took the stand. He maintained his posture of indifference. When asked about his father's death, he deflected. When asked about the live stream, he talked about the engagement metrics. When asked directly if he felt remorse, he said that he did, but his words didn't match his tone. He seemed irritated at having to explain himself, seemed resentful of the questioning, seemed to believe that he was the victim of circumstances rather than the perpetrator of a crime. During cross-examination, the prosecutor asked pointed questions about the planning. When had he decided to kill his father? The boy tried to maintain that it had been a spur-of-the-moment decision. The prosecutor showed him the deleted draft streams. The prosecutor showed him the search history. The prosecutor showed him the timeline of the planning. The boy's composure began to crack. His answers became defensive. He stopped trying to maintain the narrative that it had been an accident and instead argued that his father had deserved it, that his father had been trying to ruin his life, that he had no choice. The transformation was significant. The boy had finally revealed his actual beliefs. He thought he was justified. He thought he was the wronged party. The jury watched this testimony with growing certainty. They had heard the evidence. They had watched the live stream. They had listened to the testimony. They understood what had happened and why it had happened. They were ready to render a verdict. The jury deliberated for 2 days. 2 days of reviewing evidence, discussing testimony, wrestling with the question of how to hold a child accountable for a serious crime while also acknowledging his age. 2 days of trying to reconcile the technological sophistication of the premeditation with the biological reality of an adolescent brain. 2 days of attempting to understand how a 14-year-old could be so disconnected from reality that he believed killing his father would somehow improve his life. On the morning of the 3rd day, the jury sent a note to the judge indicating that they had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled. The boy was brought in from the holding area. His expression was difficult to read. He seemed uncertain for the first time, as though the reality of judgment had finally penetrated his denial. The jury entered. The foreperson stood. The judge asked if they had reached a verdict. The foreperson answered yes. On the charge of murder, how do you find the defendant? Guilty. The word hung in the courtroom. The boy's mother, who was in the gallery, let out a sound that was half sob, half expression of acceptance. The older relatives of the father who were present in the courtroom showed no visible reaction, but the tension in their bodies eased slightly. Justice had been delivered. The crime had been acknowledged. The perpetrator had been held accountable. The boy's reaction was the most telling. For the first time since his arrest, genuine emotion crossed his face. Fear. The reality of consequence had finally become real. He was no longer a person performing for an audience. He was a convicted murderer. He was looking at decades in prison. He was looking at a future that had been fundamentally altered by his own actions. The composure cracked. The performance stopped. For a moment, the authentic boy was visible, scared, uncertain, understanding for the first time that actions had consequences that couldn't be undone. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks after the verdict. The boy's attorney made arguments for leniency. He presented evidence of the boy's troubled childhood, his parents' divorce, his struggle with attention-seeking behavior. He presented information about the boy's intellectual capabilities, his potential for rehabilitation, the possibility that he could eventually become a contributing member of society if given the chance. He asked the judge to consider the boy's age, to recognize that he was still developing, to believe in the possibility of change. The prosecutor made the counter-argument. He presented evidence of the premeditation, the planning, the calculated nature of the crime. He presented the impact on the community, the trauma caused by the live-stream nature of the crime, the message that would be sent if a 14-year-old who carefully planned to murder his father for the sake of digital engagement was given a light sentence. The prosecutor asked for accountability, for a sentence that reflected the severity of the crime. Victim impact statements were presented. The father's sister spoke. She described her brother, his character, his love for his son despite the conflict between them. She spoke about the loss, the empty place at family gatherings, the way his absence would be felt forever. She spoke directly to her nephew, the boy in the courtroom, and asked if he understood what he had taken, whether he could ever truly comprehend the magnitude of what he had done. The words hung in the air. The boy did not respond. Judge Hernandez delivered the sentence. She addressed the boy directly. She told him that he had committed a terrible crime. She told him that premeditation and calculation had made the crime even more serious. She told him that his lack of remorse suggested that he did not fully understand the gravity of his actions. She told him that streaming the crime, that seeking attention through the murder of his father, revealed a fundamental disconnection from reality that was disturbing. She told him that he would spend the next 30 years in prison. She told him that when he was released, he would be in his mid-40s, that his youth was being taken from him, but that this was the consequence of his choices. She told him that she would have considered a life sentence without parole, but that his age had prevented her from imposing that sentence. She told him that if he ever killed again, if he ever harmed another person, the system would have the opportunity to try him in adult court with full knowledge of his prior crime. The gavel came down. The sentence was final. The boy was led away from the courtroom. His mother did not stand. She sat with her face in her hands. The proceedings were over. Justice had been delivered. The sentence had been determined. And somewhere in the digital world, the live stream of the crime still existed in archived form, a permanent record of the moment when a boy decided that digital fame mattered more than his father's life. The impact of the case extended far beyond the courtroom. The platform on which the live stream had occurred announced new policies aimed at preventing similar crimes. They implemented systems to detect concerning behavior. They created protocols for removing content that depicted violence. They began to monitor streams that showed signs of escalation or danger. These were responses to a specific incident, but they affected millions of users. The balance between free expression and safety had to be reconsidered. The father's family held a private memorial service. Unlike the media circus of the trial, the memorial was quiet and restricted to immediate family. They talked about the kind of man he had been, the life he had lived, the potential futures that had been taken from him. They talked about forgiveness, though forgiveness felt impossible. They talked about trying to move forward, though forward felt unclear. The boy's mother attempted to rebuild her life. She moved to a different city. She changed her name. She tried to distance herself from the case, from the publicity, from the association with her son. But the internet doesn't forget. The case was discussed on true crime podcasts. The live stream was referenced in articles about technology and violence. Her son's name and face were available to anyone who searched for them. She couldn't escape it. The public knowledge of what her son had done was permanent. The boy's older siblings struggled with what had happened. They had lost their father. They had lost their brother to prison. They had been forced to confront their sibling's capacity for violence, his willingness to commit murder, his fundamental inability to care about anyone except himself. Some tried to maintain contact with their brother in prison. Some cut off all communication. The family fractured in ways that would never fully heal. The question that lingered was whether justice had been served. Was 30 years in prison an appropriate sentence for a 14-year-old who killed his father? Was rehabilitation possible? Could he ever become someone who understood what he had done, who felt genuine remorse, who became a person different from the one who had committed the crime? These questions were debated in justice forums, in sociology classes, in coffee shops across the country. People had different answers depending on their beliefs about punishment, rehabilitation, and responsibility. The live stream that had broadcast the crime was eventually deleted from the platform entirely. The clips that had been shared across social media were gradually removed through a combination of platform policies and copyright claims by the victim's family. But the digital footprint never fully disappeared. The stream existed in archived form. Portions of it existed in screenshots. The knowledge of what had happened existed in the collective memory of people who had watched it in real time. Years later, investigative journalists analyzed the case. They looked at the warning signs that had been missed. They looked at the way that the platform had rewarded engagement without considering the psychological impact of that reward. They looked at the boy's search history, his behavior patterns, his descent into an obsession with digital validation that eventually consumed his entire moral framework. They tried to understand how a child could become so disconnected from reality that he could kill his father, and believe that the positive engagement from the crime would somehow outweigh the loss. The case became a touchstone for discussions about technology and violence. It was used as an example in schools when teaching about the impact of social media. It was referenced in policy discussions about platform responsibility. It was analyzed in psychology classes as an extreme example of how the human need for social validation could be manipulated and distorted by digital systems. The crime, which the boy had committed in hope of becoming famous, had made him famous, but not in the way he had imagined. He was famous as a cautionary tale, as an example of what could go wrong, as a demonstration of the dangers of unchecked digital addiction. Judge Hernandez, in a later interview, was asked if she thought rehabilitation was possible for the boy. She said that she didn't know. She said that his complete inability to understand the impact of his actions, his fundamental lack of empathy, his continued focus on his own needs even after committing the crime, suggested that change would be difficult. She said that she hoped that prison would provide an opportunity for him to develop some understanding, some capacity for remorse, some ability to recognize the humanity of the person he had killed. But she acknowledged that hope and belief in actual rehabilitation were not the same thing. The father's grave was visited regularly by his remaining family. They left flowers. They sat in silence. They remembered him as he had been. A quiet man, a dedicated worker, a father who had tried to do right by his son even when his son had rejected his efforts. They remembered that he had died not because he deserved it, not because he had done anything wrong, but because his son had chosen to kill him for the promise of digital engagement. The tragedy of it was absolute and complete. Years passed. The boy grew older in prison. He attended rehabilitation programs. He participated in therapy. Whether he developed genuine remorse, whether he came to understand what he had done, remained a question that only he could answer. His letters from prison, when he chose to write them, showed little indication of remorse. They showed continued focus on his own interests, his own problems, his own needs. The fundamental disconnection from other people's humanity remained. The platform that had broadcast the crime continued to exist. Millions of users continued to stream their lives, to seek engagement, to pursue digital validation. The story of the boy who live-streamed the murder of his father became a warning, a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of an uncontrolled need for attention. But it was a warning that was often forgotten. The algorithm continued to reward engagement. The incentive structure remained the same. And somewhere, Other children were learning that content, any content, even dangerous content, could be the path to fame and recognition. The live stream that had begun with a smirk and ended with a body had changed the conversation about technology and violence. It had forced societies to confront uncomfortable truths about how the pursuit of digital validation could warp a human being's moral framework. It had demonstrated in the most undeniable way possible that the Internet is not separate from reality, that digital actions have physical consequences, and that some moments, no matter how powerful or engaging or important they feel in the moment, should never be broadcast to the world. The camera, which had recorded everything, eventually went dark. The stream ended. The broadcast stopped. But the consequences continued. The sentence continued. The loss continued. And the lesson, carved into the consciousness of everyone who had witnessed it, remained that fame without conscience, attention without empathy, and engagement without morality are not achievements. They are warnings. They are examples of what happens when society rewards the wrong things. And they are permanent reminders that some actions can never be undone, that some moments can never be lived down, and that the camera, no matter how powerful it makes you feel in the moment, doesn't make you immortal. It just makes your crimes permanent.